everyone, and welcome to 2021. If you didn't know it already, the year is off to a quick start with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and the new Brexit trade deal that signifies Britain's final divorce from the European Union. That gives us something to look forward to as we monitor implementation of these agreements and what they might portend for Africa. But to look forward, we must examine where we're coming from. 2020 has been quite the year. The coronavirus pandemic shut down much of the world. But thanks to persistence and hard work, we realize it does not take much for us to remain connected, and the world really is a global village. I'm Amarachi Ubani, and I welcome you once again to the first edition of the program this year, with first a quick check on other discussions in diplomatic circles and a review of major highlights of 2020.
African leaders say the African Continental Free Trade Area will help bring enormous opportunities for Africa's development, creating new jobs and boosting trade relations. The agreement has so far been signed by AU members, having been successfully launched in March 2018, with members hopeful that the deal will improve businesses and living standards across the continent.
As we usher in a new era of trade and economic development on our continent, we should not lose sight of our common priority of silencing the guns. There can be no development without peace in Africa. Therefore, we should speed our efforts towards the implementation of the AU Master Plan for silencing the guns.
Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif has called on US President Donald Trump not to be trapped by an alleged Israeli plan to provoke a war through attacks on US forces in Iraq. He issued the warning on the anniversary of the US killing of top Iranian general Qasem Soleimani by a drone strike in Iraq. Israel is yet to comment. Finally, the first doses of the COVID-19 vaccine developed by Oxford University take two. Finally, the first doses of the COVID-19 vaccine developed by Oxford University and AstraZeneca have been delivered to hospitals around the UK. About 2 million doses of this vaccine are set to be supplied every week by the middle of January in the United Kingdom.
The year 2020 began with its usual optimism behind the fireworks and fanfare that greeted the start of another decade. Little did the world know that this was to be a year like no other. When the confetti had settled, the year began to unfold. First off, with the assassination of the commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Foreign Legions, Qasem Soleimani, Iran's most powerful figure after supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, by the United States. It was a huge loss for the country, but a win for American President Donald Trump.
Last night, at my direction, the United States military successfully executed a flawless precision strike that killed the #1 terrorist anywhere in the world, Qasem Soleimani.
Iran promised revenge, and it did with attacks on US-led forces in Iraq. An attack America said resulted in no casualties on its side. And then came the coronavirus that would last a whole year and which the world is still battling today. China reported a pneumonia virus traced to a wet market in Wuhan. The country tightened its measures to curb spread of the disease, including a compulsory lockdown of Wuhan for nearly 3 months. But it was already too late. The virus had begun springing up in different parts of the world, especially in Europe and in the United States, which currently has more than 20 million cases, the highest for any country, as well as the highest number of deaths. Meanwhile, the United States was gradually entering into campaign season, as November seemed not too far away and the country wondered how it will run campaign and conduct elections in a pandemic year. While President Donald Trump continued to run huge campaigns that threatened to be super spreader events, his main challenger, Joe Biden, preferred to connect with voters virtually. He eventually won the election and is set to be America's next president, amidst a slew of opposition and barricades from the Trump administration.
The people of this nation have spoken. They've delivered us a clear victory.
Meanwhile, black Americans fought back police brutality as the Black Lives Matter movement gained momentum following the killing of African-American George Floyd by a police officer in May. Protests against police brutality soon became national and were replicated in other parts of the world as well. The pandemic dominated much of discussions in the year as many world leaders fell victim to its unforgiving menace. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, Pope Francis, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, even the US President Donald Trump and French President Emmanuel Macron were a few who contracted the virus and have survived it. With many countries under lockdown, economies slowly grinded. The IMF predicted a global output would fall by 4.4%, compared with a 5.2% drop forecast during the summer, describing the coronavirus as the worst crisis since the Great Depression, which would leave deep and enduring scars caused by job losses, weak investment, and children being deprived of education. And while Africa was spared the worst of the pandemic in terms of cases and deaths, its economy took a hit. The IMF estimated that the economy of sub-Saharan Africa would shrink 3.0%, the worst outcome on record. Oil producers Nigeria, Angola, and Algeria suffered badly from the plunge in crude prices, especially in the early months of the crisis, though oil prices have slowly arrived back around $50 per barrel. African countries called for debt cancellation, seeing debt financing and coping with the pandemic would not go hand in hand in 2020. China stepped in, making two specific commitments on debt relief. The G20 Service Suspension Initiative for poorest countries reached by Finance Minister and Central Bank governors on April 15, and a pledge to provide $2 billion over 2 years to help with COVID-19 response and with the economic and social development in affected countries, especially developing countries. Meanwhile, major superpowers pledged billions in aid for developing countries. The European Union pledged 15 billion euros for help for vulnerable countries to fight COVID-19, particularly in Africa. The World Bank announced it was making available an initial package of up to $12 billion in immediate response and support to assist countries coping with the health and economic impacts of the global outbreak. The EU pledged 50 million euros for the implementation of UN response plan to the coronavirus. And as part of its overall £258 million of UK development funding in Nigeria, the UK provided £85 million in life-saving assistance in the financial year 2020 to 2021 alone to Nigeria. The pandemic also meant that the Nigerian government had to see to the evacuation of citizens abroad. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with the assistance of the Central Bank of Nigeria, aimed to repatriate at least 30,000 Nigerians. The pandemic saw the scramble for isolation centers and quarantine centers for returnees. Some countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE helped with evacuations of their own volition. As the year wore on, many global events were either postponed, rescheduled, cancelled, or held virtually because of COVID-19 restrictions. Bilateral meetings were held via teleconferencing, and the most important diplomatic event of the year, the UN General Assembly, was held both virtually and in person, covering COVID-19 protocol. It was also the year for research into COVID-19 vaccines. What would normally take years to discover produced results in months. COVID-19 vaccine trials were taking place in almost every continent, with the UK, China, Russia, and the US participating in the global COVID-19 race. A silver lining began to appear in October-November, and major rollout of vaccinations began in early December. And then a new strain of the coronavirus hit, first in the UK, then in South Africa, and in other parts of the world. By this time, the coronavirus had been reported in almost every continent. And while the coronavirus took up major focus in the year, finally, Britain continued negotiation on its exit from the European Union. It was not until December 24th a breakthrough was announced, a new trade deal, meaning that starting from January 1st, 2020, the UK would no longer operate in the EU's single market. Joining us now to discuss the past year and help us to chart the course for the new year is former Permanent Secretary, Nigerian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Joe Keshi. He joins us from Abuja. Ambassador Keshi, thank you for joining us on the program today, and a Happy New Year to you. I see you're still in the celebratory mood.
Happy New Year to you, Amarachi. Christmas hasn't ended for many of us. It's still continuing, particularly because today that we are recording, it's Epiphany Sunday. So the whole nativity story is quite a long one, and we soon end anyway, but it's nice at least to celebrate.
Indeed. And I think that we can both agree that the coronavirus played a major role in changing how diplomacy is perceived around the world, that it is possible to reduce shuttle diplomacy. But do you agree that it was quite effective, to go virtual for the better part of the year?
You are right. The coronavirus pandemic changed the world in so many ways. But in terms of diplomacy, yes, a number of meetings were held, virtually. But we must admit that there's nothing like in-person conversation, people sitting down together across tables and trying to resolve a problem. So diplomacy was also affected, but the countries with a serious agenda for the world, did not allow the pandemic to slow down their desire to continue to pursue their agenda. So you find that, for example, the outgoing Secretary of State traveled around the world a couple of times during the pandemic. The British did the same thing as they crossed the Channel to Paris for negotiations. The Chinese were not left out. So these are issues these are obviously because they have a lot that they wanted to discuss, and they believe that sitting down face to face with their counterparts will produce a better result. But by and large, it affected diplomacy in so many ways. Like, for example, the United Nations couldn't meet as usual. So most of what they did this year was virtual, and we did the same thing too. It's been catastrophic for the world, but hopefully with the vaccines, the world looks forward to a better 2021.
Indeed, you did. And I see that in this part of the world, we kind of copied some of the restrictions and protocols for coronavirus from the West. And a lot of businesses were shut here. And some businesses, it appeared, had to either reduce the number of staff, or, they suffered huge losses, losses which they're still suffering even up until now. But do you think that the Nigerian government did provide the sort of security that these businesses needed, to survive the coronavirus pandemic, as has been seen, in these countries that we're looking up to, and we're seeing how they're approaching curbing the coronavirus pandemic?
The truth that must be told, and I think this is one thing that our government should look into. The coronavirus pandemic has revealed the absence of the absence of social safety net for majority of the people of this country. And as you can see, you remember during the during the lockdown, there were so many things that happened in this country as a result of the fact that whatever protection, whatever people on the lower strata of the society had was no longer there. And this led to a number of things that we are still feeling the effect till today. So what we need, and unfortunately, government couldn't provide for everybody. The things that were said to have been provided for people, we are still debating who were the people who received it, but certainly those that needed to receive them did not receive these things. And that's why we must do a lot more. to improve our data gathering, to know who is where, so that when these things happen again, we can actually target the population that needs to be taken care of.
Stay with us. Our conversation with Ambassador Joe Keshi continues in a moment. How would you rate the Ministry of Foreign Affairs' performance in a pandemic year, a year that, no one has ever seen before in a really long time?
Well, look, the ministry took advantage of technology to continue its work. With all our missions, with missions around the world, if we needed to talk to any country, our diplomats were on ground in these countries, and they continued to do their work. So, to a large extent, compared to home ministries, probably, perhaps the only ministry that was effectively working at that time, because there's a tremendous amount of back and forth communication between headquarters and the missions abroad. So to a large extent, the ministry continued to do its work, and I'm very sure and confident that they didn't miss much. Whether they traveled or they did not travel, the work still continued the way it should be done, particularly because we have missions abroad that can transmit messages to our host, to the other host authorities. So that simply worked well. And again, this is a point that we need to make. This is why we need to, improve our technological advancement in this country. We need to do more to develop, the broadband, so that in case of future, pandemics or whatever happens in the world, we're in a position not to be left behind, but to also engage the world.
Were a lot of the evacuations this year. I know they aimed at 30,000, but I believe a lot more Nigerians saw the opportunity to come back home. Many were a bit discouraged by the fact that they had to pay their way coming back, which we have discussed this before, was not unusual. Even with developed countries, you still have to pay your way back, even in an evacuation. But you see the ministry evacuating hundreds of Nigerians back home. And then, you're comparing this with the way other countries have done it. Other countries have, it just seemed like the ministry was doing more of evacuations this year than actually bilateral relations, even though the ministry had to step in a few times, in certain situations. The most recent being the Uganda thing, with the singer who violated COVID rules, knowingly or unknowingly. And then, some other issues that have come up during the year.
Well, look, the ministry and the country reacted to situations as they arose. They had to do evacuations because a number of Nigerians were stranded. Look, nobody prepared for this pandemic. Nobody, even those who saw it coming. Even though the warnings were there many years. There's even a book, The Pandemic is Coming, And those who had early information about it, nations, nobody prepared for it. And a number of Nigerians who were out, especially those who went for medical treatment, they were caught unawares. They were caught stranded in this country. And the ministry and the country indeed has an obligation to bring everybody back home. It took a long time to bring them back home, obviously because immediately the lockdown started, airports were shut, planes were not flying, and that itself created a peculiar problem. But when the lockdowns were gradually removed and planes started moving, Nigeria did its best. The ministry did its best to evacuate a number of these countries, and by then most of the people had no resources to be able to pay their way back.
We're wondering, if Nigeria really made much of an impact on the world. The president gave a lovely speech at the UN General Assembly, though recorded, as many of the other leaders did too. But when you compare that with what happened towards the end of the year, and I'm talking about the NSAS protests, it just seemed like everything else that the country may have achieved, at the start of the year, just sort of like, went flat with the way the government responded, to the NSAS protests and all the condemnation that came from around the world about how, the government dealt with this. What sort of impact do you think Nigeria made on the international community this year, in 2020? Sorry.
Well, we We want back the African Development Bank seat, at least. Dr. Adesina was reelected thanks to a serious campaign that was put to Nigeria. But beyond that, look, Marachi, I always say this, and I like to repeat it often. Foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy. And there's nowhere, there's no way rather you can be effective. You know, when your country is in such a turmoil like we were, you talked about the SARS protest. That was not the worst situation in Nigeria. You know, the Boko Haram activities, the general insecurity in the country, the kidnapping, and the ineffectiveness, you know, of the authorities to deal with this situation did not portray the country very well or encourage the country to be effective in anything, it was trying to achieve. And so for us to be very effective in advancing, our national security interests and engaging the rest of the world, we really need to do more to take care of domestic environment. And improvement in domestic environment, will increase not just our effectiveness in managing foreign policy, but it could also increase our influence.
The Biden administration has gone ahead to nominate some Nigerian Americans, if you may, into his cabinet. People have asked whether this would have any impact, on Nigeria-US relations. And let's also talk about Brexit, as the UK, at the very last minute, agreed a trade deal with the European Union, which officially begins January 1st, or officially began January 1st. Let's talk about our relations with these two countries, knowing these developments.
I know that we've been over the mountains that Nigerians have been elected, have been nominated by the incoming president of the United States of America. America, let me say this. Those who've been appointed by Joe Biden, yes, they are Nigerian born, but today they are Americans. Their first loyalty and obligation is to the American government and to the American people. So let's temper our enthusiasm. Let's not tomorrow begin to, if something goes wrong between the US and Nigeria, we start saying, what is Akin doing? Why is he not, putting up our case? No. For goodness sake, none of them is going to put up your case. Let's get this clear. They are working for the United States government, and they are not going to work for the Nigerian government. But that is not to say that we cannot link or engage them to help us when we are in some critical discussions or problems with the United States. We can. But they would engage us within the orbit parameter of the leeway they have. But from American perspective, this we must understand very clearly. So it will depend on what we do. I'm looking for that there'll be a better relation between America, Africa, and Nigeria under the Biden administration, because you have people that I believe that are going to restore the institution of foreign policy making, especially the State Department, and have those who understand and have tremendous knowledge in Africa in order to be able to engage Africa itself, which is something that was lacking under the Trump administration. So I look forward that there will be a better engagement between the continent, between Nigeria and the United States, As for your second, I've forgotten your second question now because I was laughing when you were,
It's about Brexit.
About Brexit. Well, look, finally, the British have left an organization that from the beginning, number one, they never liked to be there. There was, immediately the union was created in the 70s or 60s. The British were not part of the founding countries or founding fathers. When the issue of getting into the union came about, they were divided. Many did not certainly want to get involved. When they got involved, they became such a headache that at some point, the late President de Gaulle, actually proposed that they should be expelled You know, it's on record. But they've managed to stay on for so long, and finally, they have left to the joy of a number of European countries, particularly the EU, who says now they needed to put everything behind them and move on. But I just hope that.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Keshi. It's always a pleasure speaking with you, and what a great opportunity to be speaking with you at the beginning of a new year, reviewing the year before and also looking ahead. Thanks again, and we wish you a happy new year.
Thank you, and happy new year to you, and happy new year to all your colleagues at Channels, and to your chairman, John Momo. My compliments to him, and I think you guys are doing a good job, so please keep it up in 2021. And good luck to you all and to Nigeria in 2021. Happy New Year once again.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And that's the program this week. Thanks for watching, and let's keep hope alive that 2021 will be a lot better, more comforting, and more prosperous for us. I'm Amarachi Ubali. Thanks again.